Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
There's been no shortage of books written on hell, and countless articles and podcast episodes done on that topic, and how could one even begin to count how many church sermons have been preached on the subject of hell? What do you think, Scott?
Oh, yeah. And not just of evangelical faith and fairness. I mean, the Catholics have done a pretty good job, too, of explicating the idea of hell. And yeah, for sure.
And it has to be said that a lot of the conversation has been pure speculation about whether hell is real or not, what it's like, who's going to be visiting there. And that speculation has fueled an evolution of our concept of hell over the past 3 or 4 or 5 millennia. It's like a positive feedback loop. If we all know how annoying that can be when you hear the feedback build and change and become a shrieking. I don't know what.
No, yeah, for sure. Right? And I think it's the evolution of it is interesting in itself, right? Like it's interesting to me that most popular evangelical leaders, from Billy Graham to others, when they're confronted with that, and they're usually, I remember I think Billy Graham was on Larry King a number of times, and he would confront him with that, because it's one of those gotcha kind of things, right? And what do you think about how? And the answer is always, well, I think it's just a place where God isn't, it's the absence of God. Well, that's fine if they want to say that, but that's certainly not the kind of flowery descriptions that have been given, in the past.
Totally. And I'm sure Larry King didn't react very strongly, but otherwise, anyone who challenges the current traditional, in air quotes, the traditional evangelical idea of hell is going to meet with a very vigorous pushback from the evangelical community. It's an amplified version of Newton's third law of thermodynamics. For every action in nature, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Evangelicals can get really so very animated over this topic. And I'm not saying that to insult them. I'm not belittling them. I'm just making an observation. It's a fact from my point of view. Some hell debunkers have made quite a splash in the evangelical world. I'm sure many of our listeners have heard of Rob Bell's book, Love Wins, and the sociological earthquake that book unleashed. 5 years ago, Netflix carried a great movie called Come Sunday about how an evangelical church reacts when their pastor starts to question the long-standing dogma about hell. And it is still available, the movie. I highly recommend you watch it. Come Sunday on Netflix. It's got some top-rung actors. And according to one film critic that I checked out, the movie had a reasonably good box office returns for a Christian film. It made $100 million on a $7 million budget. So did you see the movie, Scott?
I have not seen it, but I will be now that you mentioned it.
Well, again, it's available on Netflix.
Okay.
Sometimes I have to think that it's almost like some Christians need there to be a hell, need hell to be there. It's not that they can't envision there being no hell, it's that they can't tolerate the idea of there being no hell. It seems fundamentally wrong in their minds that there isn't a place of eternal conscious torment for a majority of Earth's people, the ones outside of their own in-group, of their tribe. But we'll talk about that more when we bring our guest on. A short while ago, the publicity manager at Erdman's Publishing contacted us to tell us of a new book they were promoting with the title Holy Hell, A Case Against Eternal Damnation, authored by Derek Ryan Kubilis. And even though we've already done an episode on hell a year and a half ago, episode number 88, I thought we need to do another one here again. Not only because the author, Derek, had some new things to say that we didn't cover in the previous episode, but also because in this 5th season, we wanted to be a little bit more intentional about reconstructing a new Christian worldview, not just simply deconstructing so many ideas, but coming up with something that does work for us. And I don't think we did that too much in the previous one a year and a half ago. And then there's another reason, a third reason why we wanted to do this again. We also want to do this because many of our previous episodes, talking to people who gave up their evangelical faith, they've all talked about the liberating effect of losing the fear and trauma of hell that their church communities hammered into them. And as I said a minute ago, some people see that as a problem. They may not admit it, but they seem to talk as if we need this motivating ingredient added into the evangelical message. Kind of like I referred to adding the Brussels sprouts into the chocolate cake recipe that I mentioned a few weeks ago. For them, it seems that not including this hell ingredient weakens or waters down the good news message. And again, good news in air quotes. So we took up the offer from Erdman's, and we have the author, Derek Kubilis, right here in our podcast studio. Derek, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's really good to see you guys. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for coming. And if I'm not mistaken, the actual release date for this book was just a couple of weeks ago, right?
Yeah, February 27th.
Yeah, so it's way too early to talk about book sales at this stage in the game, so we won't. But you've got a great promotional team at Erdman's, so you must be pretty excited about this.
Yeah, they have done a great job. I have done a lot of interviews just like this one, and it's been a lot. But I appreciate the opportunity to get the message out there about this because, as you mentioned, there's been a lot of books written about it. I tell you, a lot of those books have been written by scholars and for scholars. And what I sought to do with Holy Hell, my book, was to write a book that would be accessible to everyday lay people, whether or not they had a college degree, no matter how long they've been in the church, that they'd be able to take something from it. So I appreciate the opportunity to get the message out there.
You know, I got to say that having looked through it and so on, that I found it very refreshing in that sense, because I agree with you that most of the stuff, certainly that I've studied over the years, has been on that scholarly end of things. And the angle, I guess, that you approach it from, I think is really creative. And I think, and an important part of the conversation that we probably haven't had in many respects.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah. A lot of folks come at it from either a philosophical point of view or from a scriptural point of view, and they use a lot of scholarship to kind of back that up, and that's included in my book. But first and foremost, I want to point out that a hell of eternal torment offends our moral sensibility as people who have been shaped and formed by the love and grace of Jesus Christ, that when we feel that cognitive dissonance between a loving God and a hell of eternal torment, I think we're all called to think a little deeper about that.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
Okay, so now before we get too deep into the topic, I thought we'd let the listeners get to know you, Derek. You are a pastor. You got your Master of Divinity degree from Duke Divinity School in 2010. And you're now the vicar or the pastor of Uniontown United Methodist Church in...
Oh, actually, I'm at Ashland United Methodist Church now. Okay. Methodists, they move us around, you know. So now I'm at Ashland.
Ashland Methodist United Church?
Ashland First United Methodist Church here in north central Ohio.
Okay. And why don't you give us a thumbnail sketch of your story, just very quickly, how you were brought up and...
I was raised a United Methodist, but as I became a teenager, I had more sort of evangelical leanings. I went to Malone University here in Ohio to get my bachelor's degree in theology, and kind of strayed away from Methodism, came back to the Methodist Church for a lot of reasons, but fell in love with it all over again. And then went off to Duke to study so that I could come back and be a preacher. And during that time, I didn't think a whole lot about hell. I sort of had in the back of my mind the idea of annihilationism. For those who know what that is, it's the idea that God just sort of annihilates people out of existence.
Vaporizes.
Yeah. And that made more sense to me always than a hell of eternal torment. But then, when I was at my previous church, Uniontown United Methodist, near Akron, Ohio, I was asked to teach a class at my church on the afterlife, on heaven and hell specifically. And I said, wow, okay. Number one, ironically, I don't know much about this topic, even though I had been a preacher for 8 years at that point, 9 years. And I needed to study. And so I took 6 months and I did a lot of studying. And through that time, I became a pretty committed universalist. which is to say, I became convinced that what the Bible was trying to say was that on a long enough timeline, God reconciles God's self to all of humanity and all of creation. That at the end of time, the scope of God's redemptive work will have no remainder. And so then I taught my class at Uniontown about that. And I was shocked by how much fear and grief, and I don't use this word lightly, how much trauma people were carrying around with them about loved ones, friends, family members, spouses, children who had passed away, and they were fearful that they were being tormented forever in hell.
Oh my
Or
goodness.
fearful for children who had strayed from the church. And, if they get into a car accident or something and they pass away, will they burn forever? And I realized for the first time just how profound the trauma is around issues of eternal torment.
Mhm.
And that's when I decided I needed to write a book, not a scholarly treatise, but a book that could give hope and relief to some of the people that have been carrying around that darkness for years and years and years.
So it was really your pastor's heart.
I think so. I am a pastor first and foremost. I don't consider myself to be a writer. I consider myself to be a pastor. And this is a pastoral work, I think.
Well, I think it's much needed, and it's certainly an aspect of the subject that I think has been greatly ignored. Most of the material out there is on that scholarly level, and when discussions occur, in my experience anyway, they tend to be very theological discussions, as if we're talking about some, philosophical kind of topic. And one thing I really appreciated about your book was the whole concept, do you really... Let's think about this for a minute. Do we really believe this? Because what are the implications if we really, truly do believe this? And that I thought was really, really well done.
And don't get me wrong, that scholarly work is really great.
Yeah.
Whether you're talking, and if you're a seminary person or a graduate school person, I'm talking about Robin Perry. I'm talking about Ilaria Ramelli, Al Kimmel, and probably the best treatise on universalism that's come out in my lifetime is David Bentley Hart, That All Shall Be Saved. Those are fantastic books, but the average person would have a lot of difficulty digesting that material.
Right.
And so I hope my book can fill in the gap where those brilliant books just cannot reach.
Okay. Now, I referred at the beginning, as we were setting up the stage for this topic, I referred to the fact that the concept of hell has been changing for millennia, for thousands of years.
Yeah.
I wanted to give the listeners a better understanding of exactly that, how that idea has been morphing over thousands of years. And I thought a natural starting point would be at the beginning with the ancient Hebrews, the ones whom Christians would say were the first humans that God interacted with. And so we should perhaps start with the first few chapters of Genesis when God made the first batch of humans and set them loose on Earth's stage. It would make sense that Yahweh clued them into, where they came from, how they need to get along, maybe give them some laws and guide them in how to get along. But most importantly, he told them about what would happen if they broke the rules, what they would face when they breathed their last, just to make sure that they got off on the right foot. So, Dr. Kubelis, what?
Not doctor.
Okay, so Pastor Kubelis,
we're giving you an honorary doctorate today.
I appreciate that.
So, Vicar Kubelis, what did Yahweh tell them, to the first biblical humans, Adam and Eve, if you will? What did he tell them about the judgment and hell and the afterlife?
Not a whole lot, if we're being honest. You would be loath to find anything that even resembles a hell of eternal torment.
Okay. So maybe because God had high expectations of them. So what about Noah? 1,000 years later, if you take Genesis 5 literally, after all the humans on the planet got everything all wrong, such that God had to start all over again with a new first human or a new first human family, Noah and his sons, what did God tell them? What did Yahweh tell them about hell?
Again, that's a big goose egg.
Okay. Moses. Moses comes along one more time, another 1,000 years, so 2,000 years after Adam, and Moses completely sets up Judaism with all of its laws and stuff, the sacrifices or penalties that had to be paid for breaking the rules. He must have included a lot of material about hell, right?
Bupkis. Absolutely not.
Well, then tell us for all. So now getting a little bit more serious, we're having some fun there. For all those biblical characters that we would read about in the Old Testament, David and Samuel, Noah, Methuselah, Enoch, Eve, what did they understand about this whole concept of the afterlife and hell?
Well, the first thing I always say is that I'm not an expert in Hebrew religion. So if people are truly interested in that, I would invite them to take a look at what some Jewish scholars have to say about it. But as a Christian reading the Hebrew scriptures, I can say that the conception of the afterlife throughout the entire span of what we Christians often refer to as the Old Testament period is really shadowy. There is not much there at all until you get to the book of Daniel being written about 164 AD, when you have the concept of a resurrection being made very explicit. But up to that point, the afterlife is not given much attention at all. Certainly nothing like we give it in Christianity today. And what is said about it is that there is a mysterious place called Sheol in Hebrew, Sheol, which seems to be this kind of shadowy, ethereal realm of the dead.
Dusty,
Yeah.
very quiet. Even the people, their very souls, I know that they got much of their imagery from the Babylonians, and so the Babylonians would refer to shadows. You were a shadow of yourself, and you kind of faded over time.
Yeah, I think one of the key words that people use is you become a shade.
Right.
You become kind of like a shadow. What is notable about Sheol, though, for our purposes today, is that in contemporary English translations, there are many places where contemporary translators translate the word Sheol as hell. And that is an act, I hope, of negligence. But I think what it really exposes is some of the ideology that we try to bring on to the Old Testament. In my book, I do a little word study of the King James Version. And in the King James Version from 1611, which unfortunately a lot of American Christians think is the only authorized version of the Bible.
It was good enough for Paul, right?
Yeah. In the King James Version, if you pay very close attention, you will see that when the word Sheol appears in a negative context, when the words and sentences around it have to do with pain or fire or judgment of any kind, that's when the King James refers to Sheol as hell. But when it is neutral, when Sheol is presented as just kind of a boring, liminal afterlife, when it is referred to even as something kind of pleasant, it's translated as grave or pit. Because they know if they translate it as hell, people would look at it and be like, wait, I thought hell was bad, right? So, for example, in 1 Samuel 28, Saul uses the witch of Endor to summon the prophet Samuel from Sheol. And the first thing he does upon coming back from Sheol is complain about being disturbed.
Why'd you wake me up?
Now, if Sheol were a hell of eternal torment, the way Christians often talk about it today, you would imagine that he would love having a coffee break, right? He would love to get out of there for a few minutes. But no, this shadowy realm, whatever it is obviously a place of peace for him. Likewise, in Job, I think it's 14, Job, when he's in the midst of all of his trials and his famous sort of bad things that are happening in his life, he asked that God would hide him in Sheol. No Christian would ever ask God to hide them in hell, right? Mm-hmm. Or, of course, Psalm 139 says, if I make my bed in Sheol, thou art there. As we were discussing before the podcast started, Scott brought up something that Billy Graham said about how someone had confronted him with this idea of eternal torment and how it compares to the God of love that he preached about. And he said, well, hell is just the place where God isn't, right? That's something evangelicals love to say. Hell is just the absence of God. Well, number one, in Psalm 139, we are told that God is, in fact, in Sheol, right? And Paul tells us that God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. And for centuries, Christians have interpreted that to say that God is the font of existence itself, that to be separated from God would be to not even exist anymore. So to imagine that there is a realm where there is no God is to imagine that there is a realm where there is no being, and that simply cannot exist. So from the Hebrew scriptures, we can't say a whole lot about the nature of the afterlife. But one thing we can say is that they did not seem to believe that eternal torment was a possibility.
That's right. That's very powerful stuff.
Yeah.
It was an eye-opener when I learned that myself, when I went to Div College. And one of the things I did is I wrote an essay on the soul and the afterlife, which eventually became a book. And we've done a number of episodes on that. But that was an eye-opener to me, that there was just nothing in there in that ancient Hebrew thinking of it being a place of eternal conscious torment and fire and that sort of thing.
Do you know what I think is actually the clearest example of how ancient Hebrew people probably thought about the afterlife? In Genesis 24, there is this scene when Abraham and Lot are taking their leave from one another, and they swear an oath to each other. And it says, Lot put his hand under Abraham's thigh. And that has always confused people.
Yes.
Like, what the heck does that mean? And I heard a Jewish scholar once talk about his view that what was actually happening there historically was Abraham and Lot were swearing an oath while holding each other's testicles.
Oh, really?
Now,
please?
thankfully, we don't do that anymore. I've never been a witness in court, but but the idea is that they were swearing an oath on their progeny. They were swearing an oath on their offspring. And that is really the best they could figure in terms of how to live on into the future through your children and your grandchildren and all of that. And then, of course, Jesus comes along and says, well, actually, that's true, but there is actual life to be found on the other side of the grave.
So let's talk about that then. We've just finished talking about before the Greek Empire took over the world. There was very much this Babylonian view that you've just described that. But let's now talk about what happens when Greek thinking, Greek philosophy takes over the world. And this would be the period when you get the later prophets. And then, of course, all the New Testament was written during this period when the world was being shaped by Greek thinking. They had a very different understanding of the soul and the afterlife. So why don't we talk about that?
Yeah. Well, you have this kind of Hellenization of Judaism during this period. And you start to see Jewish leaders, Jewish rabbis, start to make use of the Greek realm of Hades as they talk about the afterlife. And even Jesus refers to Hades. Now, if you've ever studied Greek mythology or ever read the Percy Jackson books, you know a little bit about what the Greeks believed about their underworld, which they called Hades. You know, it was separated from the rest of the world by the river Styx. And there was a 3-headed dog named Cerberus there, so on and so forth. But even that, you still have to admit, if you study Greek mythology, that Hades is not a place of eternal torment, right? Hades is much more comparable to the Hebrew Sheol than it is to the Christian idea of hell. Hades has places that are good, quite frankly, the asphodel meadows, where there are flowers that grow and you can spend time contemplating your life, so on and so forth. The only place...
Elysian fields?
The Elysian fields, absolutely.
Yeah.
So you have the Jewish religious leaders at the time making use of Hades as a metaphor. They're not trying to say, oh, the Greeks got it right. What they're trying to say is you need to think about the afterlife. And the Greeks have already started doing that. And here's what they think. And then they gave their own conception. The only place in Hades that is a place of torment is the realm known as Tartarus, if you've ever heard that. It's in the center of Hades. But even that torment is different than the kind of torment we talk about hell. When we talk about hell, we're always talking about physical pain. We talk a lot about fire. It's all very physical. In Tartarus, the torment people received was a little more ironic than that. This is where you have Sisyphus rolling the stone up the hill only for it to fall back down again. You know what I'm saying?
Rolling down the other side.
Yeah. Who is it whose liver
Prometheus.
is eaten? Prometheus's liver is eaten every day and grows back, so on and so forth. Or the Deniades, who have to carry these jugs of water that have holes in the bottom of them. Not even Greeks, I think, understood that to be someplace where they would go or a torment that they would experience, but rather those were about lessons to be learned. In Tartarus, as a place, is only mentioned once in the entire New Testament. It's in 2 Peter. And it's not even referred to as a place, it's referred to as a verb, that it's talking about what God did to Satan. And essentially it says God tartarized him, which makes reference to Zeus throwing the Titan gods down into Tartarus. It's an action. It's not a realm, and he never presents it as a way to think about the afterlife.
Right.
That was probably more information than you wanted.
Well, not at all. But that's only, I thought, half the story, because then you've got this word Gehenna, which is in the New Testament, it refers to Gehenna, which is, again, a completely different thing.
Most of the time that you see hell in your English New Testament, especially in the Gospels, it is a translation of the word Gehenna. And Gehenna is a real place on a map. I've been there. I don't know. Have you guys been to the Holy Land?
No.
It's a valley right outside of Jerusalem. If you visit Pilate's palace, you can see it he's got like a little portico out there and you can look down on it. It's very nice. Now it has a park. People go jogging in Gehenna, in hell, every day. Essentially what Gehenna was, it was the Valley of Hinnom. And the Valley of Hinnom was a place where, unfortunately, children had been sacrificed, most likely to Babylonian gods. And so it was a place, it was a dishonorable place. It was a place that was considered to be an evil place. And so when we have a place that we want to honor, what do? We build a monument there. We put up a visitor center, whatever. What they did when they had a place that they wanted to dishonor is they turned it into a garbage dump, which is to say all the refuse from the city of Jerusalem came to the Valley of Hinnom, and even dead bodies. It was essentially a massive pauper's grave where dead bodies of poor people would be cast. And it was obviously a disgusting place. Fires would be breaking out all the time. If you know anyone that works in the garbage industry, they'll tell you the biggest worry is fire, because the bacteria that are breaking down all the food make it very hot. And so fires would be breaking out all the time. You would have people, women especially, mourning their dead loved ones who were being tossed into this valley. And you would have dogs, wild dogs, which were a huge problem in ancient Jerusalem, who would constantly stalk around the Valley of Hinnom looking for food or meat, or presumably some of these dead bodies to fight over. And this, of course, is where we get the image from Jesus, the outer darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. The gnashing of teeth is a reference to the dogs growling at one another and chewing their food. It is not a reference to human beings who are wincing in pain. And so he uses the image of that place, I think metaphorically, to describe a kind of judgment on the other side of life for those whose lives are really poor here on this side of the grave. But he never makes any reference to it being eternal. He never makes any reference to it being never ending or to it being totally hopeless. He does use Gehenna as a kind of warning, but not the same way folks like Billy Graham and Mark Driscoll use hell as a warning.
So some of the proof texts or whatever of those who promote the idea of eternal conscious torment and so on will, for example, use Jesus' teaching on the sheep and the goats.
Yeah.
Okay. So how do you then address that? He talks about them being separated and they're going to be cast into this place of not torment, but outer
well, they want to say, yeah. So what opened this passage up for me was learning a little bit about ancient Near Eastern shepherding practices. Okay. And that, first of all, it's not simply the sheep and the goats. It is the sheep and the kid goats specifically.
Oh.
The younger goats who were famous for being very rambunctious and being where they weren't supposed to be. I think when we think of sheep and goats, we think of nice, fluffy little sheep who are very pleasant and snuggly. And then we think of goats who eat tin cans and don't have any wool, so on and so forth. That was not the ancient conception of the sheep and the goats at all. If anything, to a first century shepherd, the goat is much more valuable than the sheep because goats give better milk. It was a constant source of nutrition, whereas the sheep, you might shear for their wool and then you might eat them, but then it would be over. So the point was to preserve the life of the goats, believe it or not. And that the way you deal with goats is not by simply killing them. That would make no sense if you were a shepherd. Why would you be destroying your inventory? The point was to discipline them and to teach them where they were supposed to be, to stop screwing everything up. The punishment that Jesus describes, this phrase comes in our English New Testaments at this point of to eternal punishment. The word for punishment in Greek is the word kolossus, Kollassis, kolossus. And kolossus is a horticultural term. It is a term that is probably best translated as pruning. It is used in Koine Greek as a metaphor, not for revenge or punishment just to get back at someone, but it is used specifically as a metaphor for discipline, as a metaphor for chastisement. The goats don't need to be punished forever. What they need is to be disciplined. And of course, the word eternal is where the big crux of all this comes, that often when the New Testament speaks of eternal punishment, the Greek word is the word aionios. And aionios never meant eternal the way we use the word today, as in an infinity of time. What it meant was of the next age. So essentially, the goats are going to be disciplined in the next age. That's a lot different than saying they are going to be tortured forever.
And since we're talking about the sheep and the goats, I remember in your book you made this comment that I hadn't noticed before. You point out the fact, the contradiction or the paradox, I guess is a better word, where Jesus is talking to, or sorry, the judge, the person doing the judging here is saying to this group of people, because you didn't show compassion on the people who were sick and poor, and the ones in prison, you didn't show compassion on the prison. Therefore, you're going to be judged, but now he's going to be the judge that sends them away for eternity. He's not going to show compassion on these people. Maybe elaborate on that and do a better job than I've just done.
My point is just that the whole reason for separating the sheep and the goats in the first place is the fact that the sheep are the ones who show compassion and the goats are the ones who do not. It makes no sense then to say that because you didn't show compassion, God would not show compassion in an ultimate sense, right? It's like spanking a child because they hit their sibling. That's probably not the best way to deal with that, because all you're doing is showing them that violence is the way to solve their problem, right?
Yeah.
So why would God act completely different than the way God was telling his followers to act? You see this in the same way in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. What does he say to wrap that all up? He says, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. The idea is that God loves God's enemies, right? And that we're expected to do the same. The ultimate version of that is Jesus hanging from the cross. And he looks down at the people who have crucified him, who have oppressed his people, who have done unspeakable violence. And what does he say from the cross? He says, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. Now, after Jesus asked God to forgive those people who crucified him, those Romans, would we then assume that when they died, they were cast into hell? No. I want to say that Jesus's forgiveness is real forgiveness, right? Jesus, and this is really the crux of the whole book, is that if you take Jesus's life seriously, Jesus came to reveal the nature of God. Not, evangelicals just want to say that Jesus, a lot of these guys reduce Jesus to a transaction, right?
Right.
They say, well, Jesus came to die as a propitiation for sin. Essentially, Jesus is a debt settler. And that may be part of it. We can talk about atonement theories and all of that. But the difference is that I believe that Jesus came to reveal the character of God, to reveal who God really is, and invite us to live like our God lives. And the God that Jesus came to reveal is not a God who would punish his own children forever and ever for no reason, without any hope of redemption. That's not how that God seems to work based on what Jesus said.
Right.
In a sense, it's even worse, in the sense that many evangelicals believe that this isn't just confined to people, rank sinners, rank people who live immorally and so on. But this applies to people who might not get their idea of the atonement right, who might not believe in the incarnation. Well, they go to hell too, and unless you believe these certain things. So it's not even just behavior, right? You have to assent to certain ideas. And if you don't assent to those ideas, well, the punishment is eternal suffering. And that, I mean, wow.
I've been told that I'm going to go to hell because certainly I've been told I'm going to go to hell because I don't believe hell is eternal torment, right? But I've also been told I'm going to hell because I don't believe in the rapture, right?
Right.
Or I don't believe in dispensationalism, or I don't believe in substitutionary atonement. There's a certain point at which Christians have gotten this weapon of hell, and now we wield that weapon like a kid that found his dad's gun, right?
Yeah.
And we're just waving it all over the neighborhood, trying to get people to do what we want them to do, because it is a very, very powerful weapon. And that's what's so insidious about it. I mean, when you think about a hell of eternal torment, it's not just a dark idea. It's not just a frightening idea, but literally it is the most frightening idea possible.
Yeah.
Traumatizing.
Absolutely. And it's meant to be. The idea that you could be tortured forever without any hope of relief, that has a way of burrowing itself down into the deepest part of our psyche, such that I have, in the last few months, I have talked to people who have left Christianity for 20 or 30 years, and they still have nightmares about hell.
Yeah.
It continues to haunt them.
There's a great little book. If I say a great little book, I mean, not in the normal sense, we maybe take that word, but John Bunyan wrote a book called Grace Abounding. You may have heard of it. It's just a short book, and it's his torture, his mental torture over, he believed he had committed the unpardonable sin. And so he was headed to hell, and there was nothing that could. And it's just a horrible book to read in that sense, right? Just this man going through this mental breakdown, this traumatic mental breakdown. And, for him, he gets relief from this by, through Pilgrim's Progress, but the idea that he believes that he's saved by God's grace. And I think it's kind of interesting, Derek, I wanted to kind of mention that one of the things that you talk about in the beginning of the book, which I think is a really interesting angle, do Christians really believe this doctrine? I mean, do they say they do, but if they truly did believe it, what are the implications of really believing this? It would dominate your life, right? And I think that is a really interesting angle. The thing that came to my mind was that the way I've seen people get around that problem, if you want to put it that way, because I guess I hang with more from the Reformed side of the faith than the other, is the doctrine of election. So yes, hell's horrible and all that, but I don't have to worry about it because God has decided who's going there. And so the only thing I really have to worry about is, can I believe in that kind of God? But if I can believe in that kind of God that would elect this remnant of people and condemn the rest of them to eternal torment, if I can buy that, then yeah, I'm okay. I don't have to worry about my neighbor because, that's, God decides, that.
Yeah, well, as a good Methodist, I was raised to think of such ideas as being complete and total heresy, which is probably positive. The idea, I mean, yeah, let's take that seriously, because the Reform side of the church, what some people would call the hyper Calvinist side of the church, are the ones who talk about hell more than anybody. And when they talk about it like that, they talk about God as being one who hates. I mean, this is the way Mark Driscoll presents it. I quote one of his sermons in my book, where he's sitting there preaching this solemn duty that preachers have to explain the word of God to their people. And what does he say? He says, some of you, God hates you. Why? Because God chose to. He actually tells his people that. I'm just shocked at that. Right. Like that is the idea of double predestination, that God creates souls just to damn them. That is a morally bankrupt idea.
Totally. Yeah. Now, Derek, at the beginning of the episode, I made reference to this Netflix movie about a pastor who began to change his thinking on hell. And you are a pastor. You began to change your mind. So maybe tell us about that, why you changed your mind, and then more importantly, how have you changed your view on hell?
Well, like I said, a lot of it came from teaching that class and hearing the stories of the people in that class, and then talking to other people and learning just how people had been traumatized by the idea that their friends and loved ones, or even them someday, might be burning forever. And I realized that this is another way that the church has been causing indescribable pain to people. Even those of us, so I'm a United Methodist. We are the nice denomination, right? Like, that's about all that most people get. Oh yeah, the Methodists, they're really nice. They like to sing and stuff like that. We are a relatively progressive, mainline, white bread, milquetoast denomination. And that's what I love about it. I'm not denigrating it at all. I think that's really cool. But even we have allowed that idea of eternal conscious torment to fester in the hearts of our people, and we have caused unspeakable pain in doing that. And so when I decided to write the book, I wrote it with one very particular purpose in mind, and that is I wanted to give people permission to question the doctrine of eternal torment. I wanted them to have the freedom to say, yeah, I can ask these questions without fear. I can interrogate this idea that seems radically inconsistent with the God that Jesus came to reveal. I can do that, and I don't need to be held captive by this doctrine that has caused me pain for so long. And I really hope that that's what the book does. I'm not trying to win a theological debate here. What I'm trying to do more than anything is to help people deal. I want people to be able to live without being afraid of their God. Does that make sense?
Totally.
And I think that's what Jesus wanted too.
And you have a more redemptive view of hell. You're not just simply saying, yeah, it's a place where everyone plays basketball. It's a happy place.
Yeah.
It's a place of purging. So I'm putting words in your mouth. Why don't you tell us?
Don't get me wrong. It's not, some people have read the book and characterized me as saying, well, there is no hell, or I just kind of believe that everyone joins hands and sings Kumbaya and stuff like that. That is not what I'm saying at all. What I am saying is that there are ways of interpreting all of this that absolutely disregard the concept of eternal conscious torment. That is impossible. I'm convinced of that now. When I look at the New Testament, I cannot see eternal torment when I look there. I just know too much about the Greek language, and I know too much about first century Christian thought to be led down that road again. But what I do see, and what very ancient Christians saw, from Origen of Alexandria to St. Gregory of Nyssa to St. Jerome, and Christians, a minority of Christians throughout time have seen a period of purgation, which is to say, a period of refinement, of rehabilitation that happens to souls after death. And from the New Testament, I think we can tell that that is not a pleasant experience, right? That it is, in fact, a very difficult experience, but a necessary one. And that's why my position is called Christian purgatorial universalism. Essentially, what I want to say is everything Catholics say about purgatory is true, except that it applies universally. That everyone has their dirt on their soul that they're going to carry with them into the afterlife, and it will all be burned away. That's why so much of the terminology that we ascribe to a hell of eternal torment is actually metallurgical, right?
Yeah.
So at the end of Revelation, where it says even Satan and his demons will be cast into the lake of fire. It's not a lake of fire. In Greek, it is literally a pool of fire, which is a reference to a smelting pool. It is a pool of molten metal where that metal is being refined. You've heard people talk about a fire and brimstone preacher being a preacher who talks about hell all the time. Okay, fire and brimstone. What is brimstone? Brimstone is an old-timey word for sulfur. Sulfur is what we add to molten gold in order to create dross. And the dross is all the impurities that are in the gold. They bind to the sulfur, they rise to the top, and they're scooped away so that all that's left is the pure, beautiful metal. That's what I believe the New Testament is saying that happens to all of us. That we are all refined, that some of us need more refining than others, quite frankly, but that at the end of the day, God is capable of scraping away all of the impurity that we have collected throughout our lives until nothing is left but the pure imago Dei, the golden image of God by which we were first created. And that is the part of us that is united with God in eternal life.
So can I compare my worldview now? I've also gone through a lot of changes in my thinking.
Sure.
On many aspects of theology. And so on the whole subject of hell, I'm certainly with you on the whole idea that hell is not this place of eternal conscious torment. Absolutely. But if I'm totally transparent, I don't know what anymore to do with the afterlife because I just don't know. One can say that they believe in an afterlife, but I don't know. I don't think they can know. So I don't know. But what I do find in the teachings of Christ, and I get some of these ideas from the later writings of people like N.T. Wright and others, they talk about how the message that Christ brought was to bring heaven to earth. It wasn't that we were going to go off to a celestial
Sure.
heaven, but the Messiah wanted to bring a whole new kingdom on earth. So the whole idea of bringing heaven to earth, and I'm certainly on board with that. I want to be part of that project, bringing, changing the way things happen on earth so that it's more like, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And as far as hell goes, I think hell is certainly what we make of it here on earth. People experience hell here on earth because they've made their hells. They've made choices. They've chosen to hold anger and resentment and bitterness at people. They've chosen to have values that hurt people, and they create a hell on earth. I certainly can hang on to those ideas that we create hell on earth and we can create heaven on earth, and that I want to be part of the project. And if there is an afterlife in some celestial realm, okay, fine, I'm open to that, but I don't know that, but I certainly do know what we do here on earth.
That's fine. I definitely agree with all of that, but I do still, at the end of the day, I want to say that there is still something that is metaphysical about it, that there is something that happens to us ontologically on the other side of the grave. You're absolutely right, by the way. And I think I talk about this in the book, that whenever we think of the afterlife, whenever we think of heaven, we always think about us going up. But if you look at the trajectory, if you look at the long arc of the biblical story, it's all about God coming down. Right?
Right.
So God comes down and creates Adam and Eve. God comes down and walks in the cool of the day. In the story of Cain and Abel, God comes down and gives the law to Moses. God comes down in the fiery pillar. God comes down and fills the temple and speaks through the prophets. Until then again, God comes down in the person of Jesus Christ. God comes down in the fires of Pentecost as the Holy Spirit. And then in Revelation 21, God comes down in a definitive way. And it says, God's dwelling will be among mortals. That the final end of everything is not us going up, but it is in fact God invading and infusing the created world and redeeming all of creation. I'm absolutely there with you. But in so doing, God's fire must consume the darkness that we would bring with us. And the best metaphor for this kind of purgation that I'm talking about, that I heard, and he mentioned it after I wrote the book, and I'm like, oh man, I would have loved to put this in because it's just so brilliant and it's a story I love. But Father Al Kimmel, who wrote a great book called Destined for Joy and runs a great blog called Eclectic Orthodoxy, I invite everyone to check it out. He did an article on there one day where he compared this purgation to the story A Christmas Carol and what Scrooge goes through. And Scrooge is confronted with his own selfishness and his own greed and his own disregard for other people, his own hard-heartedness. And that creates a pain in him. And you see him go through it, that he doesn't want to see it. It's like torture. These ghosts are like really hurting him by making him walk through these memories. And then at the end of it, our movies don't do it justice, because our movies tend to have the ghost of Christmas Future kicking or throwing Scrooge into the grave. Spoiler warning if you haven't seen A Christmas Carol. But in the book, he actually is near the grave and he's holding on to the ghost. and he lets go. And he falls back into the grave. And then he wakes up again, and it's Christmas. And you get the sense that everything that was dark, everything that was selfish and terrible about Scrooge has been buried, right? It has been destroyed or crucified or burned away. And all that's left in the aftermath is joy and generosity and hope. I can't say for sure sort of what the afterlife is like, or what this purgatorial hell is like, or how long we spend there, whether or not it's an actual place. But what I can say is that we will go through that process, and we will come out better on the other side. I think the reason, part of my story that allows me to reverberate so much with that, is the fact that in 2012, I lost my leg. I was born with a congenital birth defect called a clubbed foot, and I had 8 reconstructive operations on it as a child. And it was a source of pain in my life every single day. Every day, my leg hurt. And it got in the way of so many things. And by the end, I was taking all of these opioid medicines. I was drugged out of my mind, just trying to deal with this pain. And my doctor finally said, look, why don't you just let me cut it off? And you can go through life with a prosthesis. You won't have this pain anymore. And that was consequently the worst and the best thing to ever happen to me, right? So I had to have this part of me cut away in order to experience the fullness of life. In the same way, I know I have other things about me. My selfishness, my hard-heartedness, defense mechanisms, and my judgments and my bigotries that have to be amputated. And I think the thing that we Christians refer to as hell is the process of pruning all of that rotten flesh away so that we can experience life as it was meant to be lived.
Yes, it reminds me of the Great Divorce, by C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
One of my favorite books, and that's really the fundamental idea there. And that one particular person he encounters, and he's got this horrible like this lizard that sits on his, and it represents kind of lust. It's always whispering in the ear, and the angel says to him, "I can get rid of that. It just takes a second. We can get rid of that." But the guy doesn't want to get rid of it because it's become kind of part of him, right? And there's this whole process, and finally he amputates the thing, and the guy is kind of redeemed. And you really reminded me, that's a very powerful story that you have there. Yeah, very.
For all that Dante has done, you guys know Dante. Dante's
absolutely.
Inferno has unfortunately shaped the Christian imagination around hell more than anyone else into this eternal torment kind of thing, this very physical sort of pain that lasts forever, so on and so forth. What often goes unmentioned, though, is his depiction of purgatory. That's when I become a Dante fan. Okay, is with the book Purgatoria. And at the end of it, after he climbs the mountain of purgatory, which is the ancient Catholic conception, the tree of life is at the top, but there is a wall of flame between him and that tree. And he knows he has to walk through the flame to get to life. And as he's in it, he desires to be covered with molten glass to cool himself down. That's how hot it is. Pruning these things out of our lives, pruning them from our souls, is a painful process. And I believe that's what Jesus was trying to warn us about. He was trying to warn us that we should take care of these things while we still can. But as painful as that process is, like a surgery, like physical therapy, like rehab, whatever it is, it's meant for our good. And I think Christians can believe in hell, but it's important that we acknowledge that it's holy and that God uses the thing we call hell not to punish us out of vengeance, but to refine us, to discipline us, and to prepare us for life as it was meant to be lived.
Okay, so Derek, we are out of time. Is there any other things that you want to say about this particular book that we didn't cover at all? And otherwise, are there new projects on the horizon for you?
About this particular book, not really. It's called Holy Hell, a case against eternal damnation. I do hope people will check it out and give it a read. I believe it's pretty accessible. I've been happy that people have been reading it and telling me that it was not only accessible, but that they had some fun reading it. I tried to use humor and I tried to use a lot of my own stories. I talk a lot about dogs in it.
We won't hold that against you, Derek.
And if you do read it, for your readers, if you do read it, the best, and you enjoy it, the best thing you can possibly do is leave a review on Amazon or on Goodreads. That helps the algorithms kind of show it to more people and spread the word. So that's really great. New projects. Right now, I am working on a project about Christianity and politics. I don't know exactly what shape it's going to take. I'm still in the research phase of it. The working title right now is The Mother of Heresies, and it's based off of John Chrysostom, who said the desire for power is the mother of all heresies. And we live in an age today where people are trying to use and exploit our beloved Christianity and our Jesus for their own political purposes. And I'm hoping my book will help speak to that, but that'll be years down the road when that's finished. So,
okay. Well, we look forward to it.
Thank you.
Derek, thank you so much for giving us your time. We really appreciate it, and we do recommend the book to our listeners. I echo what you said about how it is very accessible. You do not need any kind of a theological degree to read this. It's a great read, humorous at times, and I'll have links for the book in our show notes, and links for you as well, Vicar Kubilis.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Scott. It was a real pleasure being on here today.
Thank you.
Talk to you again.
Okay.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.